Hi, and welcome back to Biblical Theology, Exegesis, and Hermeneutics, where meaning is always context-driven. I'm your host, johnstraz, and today we're just going to be doing a little shorty. It's a promo for the presentation made on Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 to 31. Okay, on this particular slide, we're going to go ahead and offer a little translation and present some structural analysis for the text. So we'll begin here. For if we continuously sin willingly after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer is left a sacrifice concerning sin, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and jealousy of fire, which is about to consume those who oppose. Anyone who sets aside the law of Moses dies on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses without mercy. How much worse punishment do you suppose he shall be counted worthy of, who has trampled under the Son of God and has considered the blood of the covenant profane, by which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know the one who said, "Vengeance belongs to me, I shall repay." And again, the Lord shall judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Okay, so this is just a short little passage here, but it's full of controversy for some. I mean, actually, when you read it, it's pretty straightforward. You read it, and it basically says what it does. But as you've known, that there's a whole group of fine people, some very good Christians, but they tend to differ here, and they want to claim that the New Testament doctrine concerning the doctrine of salvation is all about once saved, always saved. Okay, and they will then try to come upon this text and impose theologies from outside of this text and put it into this text. Now, that's a classic case of what you call eisegesis. It's the very opposite of what we're supposed to be doing. Exegesis is bringing out of the text what's actually in it. And that's what we're going to do here today. And some of you will recognize this particular gentleman, and I don't. I have no ill feelings against Dr. Allen, and he's a good conservative scholar, but he has some rather strange things to say about this text, and we will see. Okay, so let's come here, and then we will look exactly at what Dr. Allen has stated in his commentary, and it is a very good commentary. I'd recommend it for you, for any of my listeners. I've enjoyed many parts of it. It's actually pretty good. But when it comes to his, once saved, always saved, it doesn't really help, to be honest with you. But let's go ahead and we'll read here what he has stated. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 3:15, warns of Christians who at the time of judgment will suffer loss, but only as one escaping through the flames. Here the loss is not salvation, and fire is being used metaphorically for judgment of those who are Christians who enter heaven after the judgment. One interesting fact, frequently missed by those who view the warning passages as referring to eternal judgment on apostates, is the absence of the adjective eternal, connected with the judgment mentioned in the warning passages. Given the frequency of the use of this adjective throughout the New Testament to speak of eternal judgment, And given the frequency of the use of eternal in Hebrews itself, the absence of the term in the warning passages is significant. So what David Allen is trying to insinuate here is that the Hebrews chapter 10 verses 26 to 31 is not talking about an apostate. For in his theology there can be no apostates of Christians. That would be an impossibility. Why? Because he believes in some doctrine called once saved, always saved. But remember, to apostatize means you have to turn away from something. So you had to have something to turn away from which to be an apostate. So he's not all there when it comes to this particular aspect of the book of Hebrews, the warning passages, which are very significant, since there are 5 of them. But what he's classically doing is, it's the sin of eisegesis. He's reading into Hebrews chapter 10, 1 Corinthians 3:15, because he's looking for some way to salvage his doctrine of once saved, always saved. Okay, but the problem here is that we have something called a Qal VaHomer argument that the author puts forward, which is a lesser to greater judgment. And where David doesn't understand is that with the lesser argument, the person dies, there's capital punishment, okay, upon the victim who rejects the law of Moses. And so then here, so when it comes here, when you're supposed to answer the question, how much worse do you suppose a punishment is the one who does these 3 things? They reject the messiahship of Christ as the Son of God. They reject Christ's sacrifice and treat it as profane, as efficacious as a pig's blood, okay, and insult the Spirit of grace. Remember, this is a document written by a Jew to Jews. Okay, so if you no longer consider the blood of Christ by which you were sanctified at one time, and you treat it now as that it's profane, well, that's why there's no longer a sacrifice that remains for you concerning sin. Because you just rejected the only sacrifice that was efficacious to cleanse you from your sins. And so you reject the messiahship of Christ as the Son of God, you reject his sacrifice, and you insult the Spirit of grace. And so David, you want to use this word eternal. Well, I think that's exactly where the author is asking you, David, the question. How much worse do you suppose? The one of punishment that that this person underneath the new covenant is going to experience, that has rejected the lordship of Jesus, has treated his sacrifice as piss, and has insulted the Spirit of grace. So, David, that's where you're supposed to put in the word eternal punishment. Because if this is supposed to be worse, the Qal VaHomer argument states that it goes from lesser to greater punishment. So that what's greater than capital punishment? Well, it's called eternal punishment in hell, David. So the very fact where you were wondering how come it didn't have it is because it was a rhetorical question asking you, David, how much worse of punishment do you suppose this person's going to have? Well, you're supposed to supply the word eternal, David. That's the whole point of the argument. Okay, now coming to this particular slide, we just want to make a few observations here. Notice here that the author is including himself along with his readers, because he states here, for if we continuously sin willingly after having received the knowledge of the truth, there is no longer left a sacrifice concerning sins, but Okay, so what is left? But a certain fearful expectation of judgment and of the jealousy of fire which is about to consume the adversaries. Okay, so obviously here the author is speaking of retribution theology, definitely not disciplinary theology. Why? Because he's referring to the people who are going to be consumed with fire as adversarial, or those who oppose. Okay, so these Christians here who have rejected the sacrifice of Christ by their continuous willingly and willful sin, right? There's no longer left a sacrifice, concerning sins, and that's because they did this after receiving the knowledge of the truth. So you got to remember that as far as the author of Hebrews, it's unknown. But we do know that he was a member of the Pauline community, or of the entourage, because he was in acquaintance with Timothy, as we find out towards the end of the book here. So then that would also then make him our author would have known, most likely, Pauline theology. And then this Pauline phrase, after receiving the knowledge, receiving the knowledge of the truth is talking about after one has been a Christian. Okay, so typically the those who espouse a once saved, always saved doctrine would acknowledge this. Now the Calvinists, they're a little bit. They just don't think this is referring to a Christian at all. So there's some really big problems with that. But anyhow, but what's important to see here is that this verse 27 here is definitely talking about retribution theology, and we'll see that come up in verse 30. Okay. That will become very clear when we see vengeance is mine, I will repay. God, vengeance is taken out upon adversaries and upon the enemies of God, and so that is the part that this crowd here, the once saved always crowd, it just boy, they forget the context here. It's all about retribution. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, now coming to this particular part of the presentation is really the heart of the matter, and so this is on the Qal VaHomer argument, and this is the Qal part here. We're looking at here at verse 28. Anyone, after having repudiated the law of Moses, dies upon the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses without mercy. Okay, so we can see here that that we're talking about capital punishment. Okay, so this person here is put to death. Okay, because he has repudiated, he has rejected, he has set aside the law of Moses. Okay, and that's what the author is putting forward in this particular text. And we will quickly move on to the... Okay, and then coming here to this particular verse, this is the Homer part of the argumentation, which is the heart of the matter. This is verse 29. And it begins with this interrogative. How much worse punishment do you suppose he shall be counted worthy of, who has trampled under the Son of God, has considered the blood of the covenant profane, by which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace. So this here, and this is a question. So he's asking the readers then for them to say, well, if the guy underneath the Mosaic legislation was put to death, then how much worse punishment do you suppose the one who has done these three things, trampled under the Son of God, considered the blood of the covenant profane by which he was sanctified, and has insulted the Spirit of grace? So we've got to remember, this is an epistle that was written by a Jew to Jews. So if you are considering the blood of Christ profane, Christ's blood is no more efficacious than a pig's blood. Then that's why the author said back there in verse 26 that there's no longer left a sacrifice concerning sin. So whatever was going on in 26, remember, meaning's always context driven. So now the focus, because the statement that if we continuously sin willingly after having received the knowledge of the truth, that can have a really wide application, and I admit that. But remember, context, meaning's always context driven, and so it's really here when we come to verse 29 where everything is focused, and the author now is just laser pointed and brought into sharp focus what he meant there in verse 26. So it's talking about a theological apostate, somebody who repudiates Christ and basically renounces Christ. So he's renunciated his messiahship. Okay, he is not the Messiah of Israel. He trampled on the Son of God. He considers the blood of the covenant profane. Okay, so it's not even efficacious as pig's blood. It's nothing, right? By which he was sanctified. So, this here really takes out the Calvinist interpretation. And has insulted the Spirit of grace. So he's he's really, this is a theological apostate. This is somebody who cannot go to heaven. It's impossible. You can't go into heaven rejecting the blood of the covenant as profane, and that you reject Christ as the Son of God. Okay, he's not the Messiah. His sacrifice is as good as pig's blood. So, and then he insults the Spirit of grace. So this guy is a theological apostate, and so he's supposed to receive how much worse punishment do you suppose he shall be worthy of, right? Well, we saw that underneath the Qal part, the guy got capital punishment. So here, this has to be eternal, all right? Punishment in hell, okay? That's what this has to refer to, because it has to be worse, because underneath the once saved, always saved position, right, the guy does not get there's no capital punishment here underneath the New Testament, okay? And according to the once saved, always saved person, the guy's going to heaven, so he's got a ticket to ride. Well, this is this is not a Qal VaHomer argument. If you believe in once saved, always saved, it's a Homer Qal argument. It becomes a greater to lesser argument. Okay, because why? Because the guy's going to heaven according to we saw here with David Allen. That this is supposed to be interpreted as disciplinary, punishment, and but it's supposed to be. This is supposed to be worse. How much worse punishment? Okay, so if he doesn't get capital punishment here, and he gets heaven, well, then he just inverted. This is a Homer Qal argument, not a Qal VaHomer argument. Okay, so the whole thing is turned upside down on its head, and we'll see in the next slide how it perfectly lines up. For we know the one who said, vengeance belongs to me, I shall repay, and again the Lord shall judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Okay, so this is, like I said before, this is retribution theology. Vengeance is mine. Vengeance is not taking out upon a Christian. This is purely, and this so in this part of the scriptural basis for the Qal VaHomer argument, that's what's going on here in verse 30. So it's talking about retribution theology, and then again, the Lord shall judge his people, and so we know that judgment here could be either vindication or judgment, but according to the context of verse 31, okay, so this is the capstone, the author's summary point here. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Okay, so there's no way that this is referring to some type of happy ending. Okay, verse 31 is a solemn warning of judgment. Okay, a fearful judgment that is going to happen to the person who rejects the messiahship of Jesus. He rejects the blood of Christ and insults the Spirit of grace. Well, then there's retribution to pay. Okay, and that's exactly what was going on in verse 27, where the fire was about to consume those who are adversaries. And remember, David, that the fire tested the works in 1 Corinthians 13, where the fire here consumes the person. That's the difference between retribution theology and disciplinary theology, David. So, and you have a very, very, very big problem, because you don't have a Qal VaHomer argument. You have a Homer VeKal argument, okay? Because the worst punishments that's supposed to be imposed upon the better sacrifice, which is Christ, and the better covenant and the better blood sacrifice underneath the new covenant, how much worse punishment do you suppose he shall be worthy of, who's done these three things? It's supposed to be worse. But your guy, he doesn't get capital punishment, and he gets to go to heaven. So there's nothing there. This is not you don't have a Qal VaHomer argument. You simply have a Homer VeKal argument.